Well, do turn to Matthew chapter 25 and verses 31 to 46. I'm going to read that now, and then we'll look at that together. So Matthew chapter 25, starting at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Well, I wonder if you can think of a time that you've got really lost. To be honest, it doesn't happen, I think, to us so much now because we've got phones that tell us exactly where we are, most places that we can be. But I can think of plenty of times that's happened in the past. I enjoy walks in the countryside, and over time I've kind of gained, at times, a reputation for getting people lost on walks in the countryside. There's a kind of process that you go through when you're leading a walk, and that starts to happen. You start to deny it first inwardly. You certainly deny it to the people around you. You don't quite let on that you don't know where you are. You kind of subtly try and consult the map and figure it out without anybody knowing. But as you find yourself kind of slipping off course and you realize that you really don't know where you are, at some point you need to stop. You need to take stock. You need to kind of look around you, look at what you can see, think about where you're going, think about a map and what that tells you about where you should be and how to get there. And we're at a point in Matthew's gospel where he is forcing us really to do that, to stop and to take stock, to think about our lives, to look around. He's talking about the end times, about Jesus' second coming, about judgment. And we've heard a couple of parables in the last 2 weeks that talk on that theme. Keep watch, the parable 2 weeks ago said, where we heard the brides waiting for the bridesmaids waiting for the bridegroom. Live for Jesus today was the theme last week, as we saw those people who were given money to use, and two of them used it faithfully, and one didn't. One didn't care about their master's money. So live for Jesus today. And today's passage helps us along the same lines. Take stock. Jesus says, stop, look at your life, look at where you're going, look at the judgment to come, and if you need to course correct, then do, says Jesus. In many ways, today's passage is the conclusion to those other two parables. It talks in plain terms, and it helps us to answer those questions a bit of what does it mean to keep watch? What does it mean to use what God has given you in the time until he returns? But while it talks in plain terms, it's a difficult passage. And you may have felt that as we read it just now, that it's difficult for a number of reasons. It's difficult because there's some stuff in this passage that probably, if we're honest, we don't want to believe. There's some stuff in this passage that you read it and on face value, you think, does it contradict some of the truths that we sing and talk about the gospel normally? And it's a solemn passage because, as Stan thought about when he preached last week, the conclusion is that there will be people who call Jesus Lord in verse 44, but who will be revealed to be those who are not part of God's people, those who don't really trust him. And so we need to take stock. We need to reflect on what we're doing with our lives. Much as if you were lost, you would look around you, look for the landmarks to orientate you. I want us to recognize some things within this passage that will help us as we stop, as we reflect. So let's start by looking at verses 31 to 32. And the first thing I want us to recognize, to see in this passage, is who Jesus is in the passage. That Jesus, as God's King, will judge the world. Jesus, as God's King, will judge the world. And perhaps that falls under the category of things that you don't really want to believe. Perhaps you're comforted by the image of Jesus as the loving Saviour, as the caring shepherd of his sheep, as the one who listens to our prayers, the one who forgives. And all of those things, of course, are true. But as judge, is that how we like to think about Jesus in our minds? The person who will condemn people? Maybe that feels uncomfortable to you, especially in the society that we live in. Calling somebody judgmental is an insult, isn't it? It's one of the worst insults, I think, that you can give to people these days, is to say they're judgmental. But it's the clear truth that's taught in this passage. Verse 31, let's look at it with me. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and before him will be gathered all nations. He will separate them one from another. So this isn't the picture of baby Jesus meek and mild that we're going to see on Christmas cards, is it, in a few weeks' time? This is a glorious picture of Jesus. It's a scary picture. It will make us feel awestruck before him. It will make us feel very small. I don't know if you've ever been to the Niagara Falls. I had the pleasure of going a few years ago, and if you go there, you can get a boat. If you go on the Canadian side, that will kind of take you up to the bottom of the falls. And as you look up from this boat, it's kind of very misty because you get all the spray from the water. But you can see these kind of millions of litres of water kind of gushing over the falls. And it makes you feel very small to be down there, this little person on a little boat with an enormous waterfall, this kind of relentless force in front of you. And I think that's something of the kind of feeling that we will feel here when we see Jesus come in all of his glory and we stand before him. So he will return as the God King, and he'll be a terrifying judge. Now that might seem a bit fanciful to you. It's a bit apocalyptic. It is apocalyptic. It's the kind of thing you might see in a movie. It's very removed, isn't it, from our experience of day-to-day living in London. But if it's an image that you do struggle to really believe, two things to bear in mind. Firstly, this fits perfectly with what God has promised would happen throughout what he reveals in the Bible. The words that Jesus chooses in verse 31, they quote what prophet Daniel said hundreds of years before Jesus came to the earth. Daniel said that there would be someone like a son of man who would be given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages to serve him. His dominion is an everlasting kingdom which shall not pass away. So the claims that Jesus is making here, they're not just things that he is making up on the spot. They're anchored in what God has revealed throughout the centuries. But secondly, in case we attempt to think this is a bit fanciful, in case we struggle to believe it, Jesus backs up his words. We've seen him do that in Matthew time and again as he performs miracles. And as we see Jesus do miracles, as he does things that only God could do, it shows his words. It shows that what he is saying has authority. And Jesus is heading to the cross here. These are the last days before Jesus heads to the cross, where he will die and then he will rise from the dead, the only person to overcome death. And I imagine you could imagine that these words that Jesus said here about judgment, they could have got around at the time, and people would have heard them. And as they saw Jesus die, they might have mocked him inwardly, outwardly. We see that in the Bible, people mocking him, saying, "Oh, hail, King of the Jews," saying, "Oh, you're not so glorious now, are you? Not the judge of the world now," as you're hanging on the cross. But imagine the difference in attitude a few days later when they saw him risen from the dead. Suddenly they'd need to take these claims that Jesus made very seriously. Suddenly they have a weight, don't they, as Jesus has defeated death. That actually what he said, that he's going to come back like this, glorious, and judge the world, that has a weight, a meaning. It's got a proof. So when Jesus makes big claims like this, we need to listen. By rising from the dead, he confirms what he says here, that he will return as judge. And so that's the first thing to take stock of, to think about here, that Jesus, that the God King, will return as judge. Try and picture that scene. Try and make it fresh in your minds. Kids, there's lots of space on the fact finders. Try and draw that scene. What do you think it would look like? I think it would look, you're going to have lots and lots of people, little people there, but you're going to have Jesus really big, aren't you? Really powerful, really glorious, authoritative. I don't know how you draw that, but you can try. And Jesus in the passage, he objectively, authoritatively starts to separate the people, doesn't he, in verse 32? Sheep, goat, sheep, goat. It's a picture of a shepherd in the Palestinian area where this was written, where goats are naughty animals. You still see that today. If you see a goat, they're very hard to control. They cause havoc. So at night, shepherds would have to separate the sheep from the goats to make sure that the goats are contained, that they don't cause havoc. And Jesus puts the sheep on his right, and he puts the goats on his left. And he does it based on, it says here, what their lives reveal. And that's the second thing that I want us to recognize from this passage, that our deeds, the things that we do, they reveal who we are. They reveal whether we are a sheep or a goat. So let's look at it. Jesus says to those on his right, he says, come. He says, inherit. These people, later on, they're described as the righteous. For Jesus says, in verse 35, I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And this is one of those difficulties, isn't it? We read that, and we think, well, I thought salvation was by grace. I thought it wasn't about what I do. I thought it was about faith, the faith that, and that God gives grace to his people who have faith. This passage is not contradicting that. This isn't a different teaching. This isn't a change of heart by Jesus. Our righteousness, the only way that we can be right before God, is by our faith, by the gracious forgiveness that only Jesus can offer. But what he's saying here, what Jesus is saying here, is that you can tell that. You can tell the people that have that faith from how they live. So to illustrate, how do you know that myself and Kathy are married? Well, you could go through records, you could look at registries, you could look at our marriage certificates, and it would tell you. But actually, hopefully our lives show it. You know, we live together, we care for each other, we provide for each other. Those things, they don't make us married, but they're a natural overflowing of being married. If those things weren't the case, something would be wrong, wouldn't it? And so it is here. Our salvation is not conditional on what we do. It's not we need to have faith and we need to do these other things. But if we really grasp what Jesus has done for us, it will be evident in how we live. We'll naturally serve him because we'll realize that Jesus is everything to us. And so it will be evident on the last days from our lives of whether we are God's people, the sheep that he shepherds, or not. But what does that look like? What exactly does that look like? What's the best evidence that we are living for Jesus? Well, that's exactly the question that the people ask here. They say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you thirsty or give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it for the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. See, our love for Jesus is seen in our love for other people, but specifically, and this is really key, it's seen in our love for other Christians, our love for the church, in fulfilling the basic physical, spiritual, emotional needs of our Christian brothers and sisters. Verse 40 says, I see, as you did it to the least of these my brothers, you did it for me. And whenever Jesus talks about his brothers in the Bible, he's talking about his followers, his disciples. It's never a generic term for all mankind. It's people who believe and trust in Jesus. We're united together with him. And so we, in this building, we may have different backgrounds, different temperaments, different political persuasions, different interests. But we have one thing in common, the most important thing, that Jesus has worked in us. He's called us into his family. And how we treat each other will unmistakably reveal whether or not we're one of God's people. And let me say, this is one of the reasons that Christians must be part of a church. Being a Christian on your own is not okay. Online church is not enough. Unless we're part of a physical body of people, we won't have this opportunity, will we, for our love for Jesus to outflow to other people. It's why it's so important to be part of a church. It's why being interdependent in God's family is one of the core values that we have as a church. We want to be there for each other because God has been there for us. And the flip side of that is that actually if you're the one suffering in church, if you're in need, the church is somewhere that you should feel able to come to for help. The Bible talks about Christians being united with Jesus, being one with Jesus. And so actually what Jesus is saying here is true in a very literal sense. If we care for other Christians, and those other Christians are united to Jesus, what we're doing is we are loving and caring for Jesus. To illustrate, I was trying to think of a good way of illustrating this, and I'm not sure this is a great way, but work with me. Imagine you had a great friend from many years ago. Maybe you knew them from when they were very young, you were very close, and they've since moved up, and they've moved to Ukraine. And over years, you stayed in contact, you pray with them, you care deeply for him. And imagine that as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, his wife and children, who he's met out there, who maybe you don't know very well at all, they escape to the UK. He stays there to serve, but they come over. Now what do you do when those people, when his wife, his children come? How do you show your love to your friend? Well, you're not going to say, well, I don't really know your wife and children, but when you come over, if you make it over, we'll catch up over a beer. No, you're not. You're gonna say, actually, I care for you, and so your wife and children are welcome. I'll look after them. I'll care for them because I love you. And Jesus may not be physically with us today, but his family are. They're the people in this building, sat next to you, sat in the rows in front and behind you. Jesus may not be physically with us, but if we love and we care for him, that will outflow to each other. Our deeds reveal who we are. And for those of us who are in Jesus, God will see inevitably our love and care for other Christians through generosity with our money to other believers in needs, through generosity with our time to support people who need help, generosity with our our words of encouragement, through our generosity in how we spend time praying for each other. And so, again, this is something to recognize, to take stock, to think, actually, are these attitudes we see in ourselves? Because our deeds reveal who we are. But the final thing I want us to see in this passage, the final thing to recognize, the final uncomfortable truth, and again, something that we don't necessarily want to believe, is that the outcome for the person who is not in Jesus, the outcome for the person who's revealed by their deeds not to be a Christian, is punishment. Eternal punishment, it says. We like to think, don't we? We like to think that things will get better. When things are hard, we think, well, tomorrow's a new day, things will improve. But for some people, that won't be the case. Verse 46 says that they will go away in the last days to eternal punishment. And that's a very hard truth, isn't it? But it is unquestionably what Jesus teaches here and elsewhere. And we need to remember as we think on this, don't we, that apart from Jesus' gracious work in us, this would be the destination for all of us. It's not that some people are good enough. It's not that some people kind of visit enough people in prison, or some people spend enough time with sick people and they're okay and the others aren't. No, none of us are good enough. The Bible says, you may be familiar with the verse, it says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And I found that helpful when you think about that picture that kids maybe you've drawn of a glorious Jesus returning with his angels. And we stand by, but before that, by nature, all of us fall short of that glory. You're probably familiar with scenes from films where someone has to cross a huge gap or a ravine. Maybe they're trying to run or jump over it to escape from something, maybe driving a car up a ramp. And on those films, what happens? They kind of accelerate to the edge of the gap. They go up in the air, don't they? And the film probably slips to kind of slow motion. You see this car kind of going up, coming down, and you're thinking, is it going to land? And it goes down, and it drops below the level of the other side and falls into the ravine because it's fallen short of where it was trying to get to. And faced with the glory of Jesus, all of us will fall short on our own. None of us can live a life that is going to get us there. But by the grace of Jesus, by the grace of God in Jesus, those who trust him will make it across that gap, not because he gives us, not because we do anything, not because we are good enough, but because he gives us the ability to do so. We get across that clinging to Jesus. And as the passage shows, that will reveal itself in how we live, in how we treat our brothers and sisters, that we love him, we cling to him. But for the one that doesn't cling to him, for the one that doesn't trust Jesus, there isn't that hope. There is no way across without Jesus. And so the inevitable consequence, Jesus tells us, is punishment. And know that, as we thought earlier, that those who have rejected Jesus throughout their lives, alongside them, there will be people, some of these people, who have called Jesus Lord, but actually their lives will reveal that they haven't really trusted him at all. Their lack of compassion and care for followers of Jesus will show that they aren't really his at all. So the final thing, three things we've seen, and we're going to think about the implications of this in a second, but we've seen that Jesus will return as the glorious God King to judge. We've seen that our deeds will show who we are, and we've seen the consequence of judgment, that those who are revealed to be part of Jesus' followers will stand, but those that don't will go to punishment. And so recognizing those truths, kind of standing back and taking stock of them, and they're all hard truths, we want to spend a few minutes just thinking on the implications of that. So we should simply seriously ask the question of saying, actually, if somebody was to look at our lives, at the totality of our lives, to look at what we did in the last week or month, if we were to stand in a court and have evidence presented about our lives to the court, would people be able to conclude from that, from how we cared for the church, the people around us, that we are one of God's people? The title that I put on the sheet for this sermon was Jesus' Holy Church. So the word holy, it means to kind of separate from sin. And by church, it just means God's people. And so what we see in this passage is Jesus literally doing that. He is separating his church. He's gathering his holy church. And his holy church have this thing in common, that they love each other because they love him. That's why when we take the Lord's Supper, which we will in a minute, we normally say before that if you have some grievance with another Christian, if you've fallen out with another Christian, you should deal with that before taking the Lord's Supper. Because actually eating this bread, drinking this wine is a sign that we are part of God's people. But if we're harboring some resentment against other people, that's in contradiction to that. That's in contradiction to what it is to be a part of God's people. So this passage forces us to ask that question, actually, what does my life reveal? Does my life reveal that I am a part of God's holy church? Not by whether we attend this building Sunday by Sunday, but how we love and how we care for the people that are in it. Are we willing to sacrifice the things that are most precious to us? Time, money, our energy, our emotional energy to be with people. But what if, as we look at this, we feel we don't stack up particularly well? I'm guessing that actually, as most of us look at this, as most of us think of this, we feel that way to some degree. We're conscious that there are ways we could care better for those in the church. Maybe we feel actually, when we look back at our last week or a month, it hasn't really been a priority for us. And let me say this, the solution to that is not to think, well, I'm going to try harder to be a really nice person. I'm going to try and spend more time with people. I'm going to try and give more money. Doing that is like treating the symptoms rather than treating the underlying cause. In fact, it could just be covering over the symptoms. We need to think about the underlying cause. If you're feeling, as you read this passage, that God is challenging you, that you actually have a lot of the goat characteristics that we see here, the answer is to turn again to Jesus. To repent that, even though he has loved us with a perfect love, that we haven't shown that love to the others that Jesus loves. And in humbly remembering that the love that Jesus has shown you, the care for the church will flow out naturally. It's interesting, isn't it, in the passage that both the sheep and the goats are surprised at Jesus' judgments. The sheep are surprised. They say, "When did we see you, Lord? When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink?" And why are they surprised? Because they're hardly conscious of the ways they've served Jesus. It comes naturally as an outflow of their love for him. And the goats are surprised as well, aren't they? "Lord," they say in verse 44, "when did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or sick or in prison and not minister to you?" They're surprised. There'll be those, won't there, who've lived a good life by our standards, who are not murderers. They're nice people. They give to charity. They give money to the homeless person on the streets. They're surprised when Jesus says to them, actually, none of that was done out of a motive of serving me. We may be a nice person by the standards of the world, but if we don't care for Jesus' people, if we don't care for the people of God, it's a sign that we don't care for Jesus. The passage causes us to take stock by considering our attitude to Jesus' holy church, to the people in this building. And in doing so, Jesus wants us to turn back to him, to, as we saw in those parables that we've read over the last couple of weeks ago, to keep watch for him, to live our lives today in response to his love for us. And so let's end, and it is a solemn passage, it's a hard passage to think about, but let's end with a note of encouragement. Jesus invites us all to do this. to keep watch, to live for him, so that on that day when he does return as glorious judge, he will say to his followers, I know you. Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from before the foundation of the world. The first, if you've got the fact finders, the first question that I put on the fact finders was how does it make you feel that Jesus, our glorious King, will judge what you do? And I put a multiple choice. I put 3 answers. I said, does it make you feel scared, happy, or comforted? And actually, it's a bit of a trick question, because for the Christian, all 3 of those are true. As we stand before Jesus, our glorious King, we will feel that sense of awe and of fear. That is right. But knowing that he is our King and he is for us will make us feel very comforted. And knowing that he has prepared a future kingdom for his people from before the beginning of the world will be the best feeling in the world.